I have learned over decades of service that the first warning sign of strategic deception is language that sounds virtuous but explains nothing. Liberation is one of those words. It is invoked not to clarify intent, but to conceal it. When American officials speak of liberating Iran, they are not describing a plan rooted in military feasibility, political responsibility, or respect for sovereignty. They are deploying a rhetorical device designed to make power projection feel like a moral duty. I have seen this pattern before. Liberation was the word used in Iraq, even as planners ignored the basic realities of sectarian balance, state collapse, and post-war governance. Liberation was spoken in Afghanistan, while logistics, culture, and endurance were treated as afterthoughts. In each case, the word preceded disaster because it replaced analysis with assumption. It allowed policymakers to avoid the most important questions: who governs the day after, at what cost, and with whose consent. Iran exposes this deception more clearly than most. A nation of nearly 90 million people with deep historical memory, complex internal politics, and a proven capacity to resist external pressure cannot be liberated from the outside without catastrophic force. Anyone with even a rudimentary understanding of warfare, insurgency, or national identity knows this, which tells me something important. Liberation is not the objective, it is the cover story. In intelligence work, we are trained to separate stated intent from operational behavior. When I apply that discipline here, the contradiction is obvious. The same voices that speak of Iranian freedom simultaneously support policies that degrade civilian life through sanctions, sabotage economic stability, and openly discuss the fragmentation of the Iranian state. Liberation does not begin by impoverishing a population. It does not rely on collective punishment, and it does not dismiss sovereignty as an inconvenience. The cause of this linguistic fraud is not ignorance, but convenience. Liberation language allows Washington to posture morally while avoiding accountability for consequences. It transforms coercion into compassion and destabilization into virtue. The strategic misjudgment is believing that Iranians will mistake pressure for benevolence. They will not. No one ever has. The consequence is predictable. Each invocation of liberation deepens distrust, hardens resistance, and narrows the space for genuine diplomacy. The lesson, borne out by history, is stark. When liberation is spoken without realism, it is not a promise, it is a warning. I have spent enough time inside the machinery of national security to recognize when a country is spoken about as a problem to be managed rather than a people to be understood. Iran falls squarely into that category. In Washington, Tehran is not approached as a society with internal dynamics, political evolution, and legitimate grievances. It is treated as a strategic obstacle, a node of resistance in a regional system that the United States believes it is entitled to shape. Since the Iranian Revolution, U.S. policy has been driven less by outrage over Iran's domestic governance than by anxiety over lost control. Iran disrupted an American security architecture built on compliant allies, predictable energy flows, and unquestioned U.S. military primacy. From that moment forward, Iran's very independence became the offense. Its foreign policy choices, regional alliances, and insistence on strategic autonomy marked it not as a moral cause to be supported, but as a strategic deviation to be corrected. This distinction matters. When a nation is viewed as a moral cause, policy focuses on engagement, reform, and responsibility for outcomes. When it is viewed as a strategic problem, policy centers on pressure, containment, and coercion. Iran has always been placed in the second category. Sanctions, isolation, covert action, and military signaling are not tools of liberation. They are instruments designed to constrain state behavior, limit strategic reach, and impose costs for defiance. The nuclear issue illustrates this clearly. The overriding concern in Washington has never been Iranian democracy. There has been the possibility that Iran might achieve a level of deterrence that restricts U.S. freedom of action in the region. A state that cannot be easily threatened, sanctioned, or attacked is a strategic complication. Preventing that outcome has guided policy far more consistently than any concern for the rights or aspirations of Iranian citizens. The strategic misjudgment lies in believing this distinction can be concealed behind moral language. Iranians understand when they are being pressured for geopolitical reasons. They understand when economic pain is inflicted, not to help them, but to bend their state. History teaches us that populations rarely respond to such pressure by embracing the intentions of the power applying it. The consequence is a self-defeating cycle. By treating Iran as a problem rather than a society, U.S. policy reinforces the very resistance it seeks to weaken. The lesson is one I learned early in uniform. Strategy divorced from human reality does not produce liberation. It produces endurance, defiance, and a conflict without resolution. There is no serious discussion of Iran that can begin without confronting 1953. I say this not as a historian chasing the past, but as an intelligence officer trained to identify formative trauma. Nations, like individuals, remember violations of trust, and in Iran, the overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh is not a footnote. It is a wound that never healed because it was never acknowledged honestly by the power that inflicted it. Mossadegh was not a revolutionary ideologue. He was a nationalist who believed Iran should control its own resources, particularly its oil. That decision collided directly with Western economic interests and strategic convenience. The response was not negotiation or respect for sovereignty, but covert action. Intelligence services engineered political chaos, manipulated public unrest, and removed a democratically elected leader to restore a monarch more compliant with Western priorities. The operation succeeded tactically. Strategically, it was a catastrophe whose consequences still define the region. From that moment on, Iranian perceptions of the United States were anchored in experience, not ideology. Iranians learned that Western talk of democracy had limits, and that those limits appeared precisely where Iranian independence began. The Shah's subsequent rule, sustained by external backing and internal repression, reinforced the lesson that foreign powers were willing to sacrifice Iranian political development for stability on their own terms. When the revolution came decades later, it did not emerge from religious fervor alone. It emerged from accumulated memory. The revolution was as much a rejection of foreign manipulation as it was a rejection of the monarchy. This is the part Western policymakers consistently fail to grasp. They treat Iranian distrust as propaganda when, in fact, it is historically earned. The strategic misjudgment has been persistent. By refusing to acknowledge the significance of 1953, U.S. policymakers convinced themselves that Iranian hostility is irrational or ideological. This allows them to believe pressure will break resistance. But pressure applied to a society with a long memory does not produce submission. It produces defiance shaped by history. The consequence is that every American action is filtered through that original betrayal. Sanctions, covert operations, threats of regime change, all are interpreted as continuations of a familiar pattern. The lesson is uncomfortable, but unavoidable. You cannot build trust on a foundation of denial. Until the shadow of 1953 is confronted honestly, every claim of liberation will be heard in Iran not as hope, but as a warning. In military doctrine, a siege is not designed to liberate a city. It is designed to break it. Food, medicine, trade, and movement are restricted until the population bends under pressure and the defenders are forced to choose between collapse and surrender. When I examine the sanctions regime imposed on Iran, I do not see an economic policy. I see a modern adaptation of siege warfare, sanitized by bureaucracy and justified with moral language. Sanctions are presented as a humane alternative to war. That is the claim. But anyone who has studied conflict understands that denying a society access to finance, energy markets, industrial inputs, and medical supplies is not a benign act. It is an attempt to weaponize civilian hardship in pursuit of political outcomes. The theory is simple and flawed. Make life unbearable and the population will turn against its government. History shows the opposite more often than not. Iran has lived under this pressure for decades. Each escalation has been framed as targeted, calibrated, and reversible. In practice, the impact has been systemic. Currency collapse, inflation, unemployment, and shortages do not remain neatly confined to political elites. They spread outward, hollowing out the middle class, degrading public health, and narrowing the space for civil society. This is not collateral damage. It is the mechanism of coercion. The strategic misjudgment lies in misunderstanding how societies under siege adapt. States restructure, informal economies grow, external partnerships shift, political power centralizes. Hardliners thrive not because they are popular, but because siege conditions reward control, discipline, and resistance. Sanctions do not weaken the state's coercive capacity, they often strengthen it. They do not empower reformers, they discredit them by associating engagement with humiliation. From a realist perspective, this is not surprising. No nation interprets economic strangulation as an act of goodwill. Iranians do not experience sanctions as pressure applied on their behalf. They experience them as collective punishment imposed from abroad. That perception matters more than intent, because perception shapes behavior. The consequence is strategic stagnation. Sanctions entrench hostility while providing Washington with the illusion of action. They allow policymakers to claim toughness without accepting responsibility for outcomes. Meanwhile, Iran absorbs the pressure, adapts, and remembers. The lesson is one every soldier learns early. If you surround a city and starve it, do not pretend you are doing it for the people inside. I have never encountered a serious military professional who believed regime change was simple. Removing a government is not the same as controlling what follows. Yet in Washington, regime change has become an abstract objective detached from the obligations that come with it. Iran is spoken of as if its political system could be dismantled without consequence, as if the collapse of authority would naturally give rise to something more agreeable, more manageable, more aligned with Western expectations. This is not a strategy. It is wishful thinking dressed up as policy. The United States has developed a habit of desiring outcomes without owning processes. Regime change is invoked rhetorically, hinted at through sanctions, covert action, and information warfare, but rarely accompanied by a serious discussion of responsibility. Who governs the day after? Who secures borders, controls weapons, stockpiles, maintains basic services, and prevents fragmentation? These questions are avoided because answering them exposes the cost and complexity of the ambition. Iran presents a particularly stark case. It is not a brittle state propped up by a single ruler. It is an institutional system with layered power centers, security forces, and ideological legitimacy among portions of the population. Any attempt to collapse that system from the outside would not produce liberation. It would produce a vacuum. And vacuums, as we have seen repeatedly, are filled by violence, fragmentation, and prolonged instability. The strategic misjudgment lies in assuming that chaos can be selectively applied. Policymakers imagine pressure without breakdown, collapse without responsibility, transformation without bloodshed. But war and coercion do not operate on intent. They operate on consequence. When the state weakens, civilians suffer first. When authority erodes, armed actors multiply. When legitimacy fractures, recovery takes generations. What is striking is how little these realities matter in policy debate. Regime change is floated as a desirable end state precisely because it remains hypothetical. It allows officials to posture without planning, to threaten without committing, and to avoid accountability for outcomes they are not prepared to manage. The consequence is paralysis masked as resolve. Iran remains hostile, sanctions remain in place, and the fantasy of collapse substitutes for diplomacy. The lesson is as old as warfare itself. If you are unwilling to take responsibility for what comes after, you have no business seeking to tear down what exists. I have watched the war in Ukraine not only as a conflict in its own right, but as a mirror reflecting how Western power now operates when belief replaces assessment. Ukraine matters here because it exposes the limits of credibility, the space between what Western governments say they can do and what reality allows them to sustain. For Iran, that gap is not theoretical. It is instructive. From the beginning, Western leaders framed Ukraine as a test of will, a struggle where resolve alone could overcome material constraints, escalation risks, and geography. I recognized the language immediately. It was the same language used before other strategic failures, confident, declarative, detached from logistics and end states. Ukraine would be armed without limit. Russia would be weakened decisively. Victory was treated as inevitable because it was morally necessary. But war does not reward narratives. It rewards industrial capacity, manpower, training pipelines, and escalation control. As the conflict dragged on, the contradictions became visible. Stockpiles dwindled, production lagged, unity frayed, promises outpaced delivery. The West discovered in real time that credibility is not asserted, it is sustained through capability and endurance. This matters profoundly for Iran. When Washington threatens consequences, Iranians now measure those threats against observable performance. They see a West struggling to sustain a proxy war on Europe's doorstep. They see political fatigue, economic strain, and strategic ambiguity, and they draw conclusions. Deterrence weakens not when power disappears, but when claims exceed capacity. The strategic misjudgment is believing credibility can be compartmentalized. It cannot. When red lines shift in one theater, they are discounted in another. When commitments are framed rhetorically but managed cautiously in practice, adversaries adjust. Iran is not blind to this. Its leaders study outcomes, not speeches. The consequence is erosion. Coercion loses force when credibility decays, threats ring hollow when resolve proves conditional, and diplomacy becomes harder when pressure is no longer believed. The lesson reinforced by Ukraine is unforgiving. Power that relies on narrative instead of reality eventually exposes itself. And when it does, those watching in Tehran and beyond recalibrate accordingly. There's a rule I learned long before I ever wore a uniform. Reality is patient, but it is never forgiving. You can postpone reckoning with slogans, sanctions, and threats, but you cannot cancel it. For decades, U.S. policy toward Iran has been built on denial of history, denial of limits, denial of responsibility. Liberation was promised, pressure was applied, and outcomes were assumed. What was avoided consistently was honesty. Power that refuses to acknowledge its constraints begins to operate in fantasy. It speaks in absolutes while acting cautiously. It threatens collapse while fearing escalation. It claims moral authority while imposing collective suffering. Over time, this contradiction erodes not only external credibility, but internal coherence. Strategy becomes reactive. Policy becomes ritual. Words are repeated long after they have lost meaning. Iran endured this long enough to understand it. Its leadership does not expect goodwill from Washington, nor does it trust promises framed in moral language. It plans instead around endurance, deterrence, and autonomy. That posture was not chosen because it was ideal, but because experience demanded it. When reality is denied, resistance becomes rational. The West now faces the accumulated debt of its own assumptions. Sanctions did not produce submission. Isolation did not collapse the state. Threats did not restore dominance. Instead, the world adjusted. Alternative partnerships formed. Power diffused. The leverage once taken for granted diminished quietly, then visibly. This is how decline operates, not as a sudden fall, but as a slow loss of consequence. The lesson is neither ideological nor partisan. It is strategic. Nations that abandon truth in favor of comfort eventually lose the ability to shape outcomes. They retain force, but lose foresight. They retain influence, but lose legitimacy. And when they finally confront reality, it is no longer on their terms. Liberation cannot be coerced. Stability cannot be starved into existence. And credibility cannot be declared by a press release. Reality collects its debt, whether acknowledged or not. The only question left for the West is whether it will continue to pay in denial or finally in honesty.